Hey, AJ Hartley here, and I haven't done one of these off the cuff videos for a while, so I thought I would do one as we move into the holiday season, and not that that's particularly relevant, but I thought today I would talk about um, the first fantasy novel that I released. It's called Act of Will. This is the original Tor hardcover. I'll talk a little about the covers maybe as we go. But as I say, it's a fantasy novel written from the perspective of an 18-year-old actor set whose name is Will, obviously. And it's set in a world that looks sort of late medieval, early Renaissance-y, something like that. Vaguely European. Obviously, it's an imaginary world, and it's different from those periods in that there's no gunpowder, no firearms of any kind, and there is magic, but it's rare, and most people don't believe in it. And the premise of the story is that Will, it's his 18th birthday, which is the day that he's going to graduate from being an apprentice actor, playing bit parts and smaller roles and writing a little, to joining the company officially. But the place where he lives and performs is under the control of the Diamond Empire, who are opposed to theatre in principle because they think it's subversive. So on the day that he's about to get his big break, the Diamond Empire show up and shut the theatres down and try to arrest anybody who they think is a problem. His name is on the list, and while he may be able to have sort of survived the experience, he panics and runs, which immediately puts him top of the wanted list. He runs into the arms of a group of rebels slash adventurers, and they sort of get him out of the city, which is what he wants. But it also means that he's somewhat dependent on them. They are, like a lot of classic fantasy heroes, they're sort of noble and principled, and they are about to go and do a job which is shrouded in mystery and danger. And Will doesn't trust any of them, and is deeply skeptical of all this honor and valor and stuff. He certainly doesn't believe in magic. So he finds himself in various kinds of dilemmas and difficulties in the course of the story. So as you get the sense that it is kind of a high fantasy adventure, but because it's told from his perspective and he is snarky and simultaneously manages to be quite clever and deeply stupid, depending on whether he's trying to show off or impress people or whatever. So it has that kind of playful tonality to it, even though, it's a fairly complex plot and there are serious issues in the book, and hopefully some sort of emotional payoff as well. And, what's odd about this book, or one of the things that's odd about this book, is that it was actually the second book that I wrote. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. Which means that I wrote it 20 years before it was published. It was published in what year? 2009. But I wrote it, 20 years earlier, or the first version of it. And I sent it out, submitted it. Nobody wanted it, including, of course, all the big fantasy publishers, including Tor. And what was weird about it was that the rejections that I got were all very positive, and say, oh, it was fun, it was exciting and funny, and but I don't know what shelf to put it on. I don't really know what it is. And I think this was partly because in the 90s, particularly, fantasy was still trying to figure out what it was. And the legacy of fantasy over the previous decades had been very much in the tradition of Tolkien. I mean, and sometimes more than just in the tradition. Sometimes it was just blatant copying but not as good of Tolkien, So there was very little fantasy that didn't have tons and tons of magic in it and wasn't about elves and dwarves and trolls and stuff. So this is basically a realist story, and it has this sort of comic, snarky kind of element to it. And a lot of the publishers were like, this doesn't fit our notion of what fantasy is. Um, so, I put it on the back burner and worked on other things. And then after I'd started publishing my realist thrillers, Mascavatrius and On the Fifth Day and stuff like that, I convinced my agent, different agent, to resubmit the book. And this time it got picked up by Tor, who had rejected it 20 years earlier. Why did they pick it up this time? Well, for one thing, I had polished the book some. It was probably a better book in certain respects. But a lot of the original complaints would have still been been valid, except that the market had changed. Fantasy altered. It became wider, broader, deeper, more subcompartmentalized. There was urban fantasy and all kinds of other little niche brackets that hadn't formerly existed. And it didn't have to be dwarves and trolls. And so suddenly there was, a place for this kind of story in ways there hadn't been before. I would also say that, the solidifying of the reputation of somebody like Terry Pratchett, which took a while to happen in the US as a serious writer, as a literary writer of quality, even though he was doing fantasy, which was often sort of tongue-in-cheek, sort of playful and comic, even within serious stories, The development of his reputation also opened the door to other kinds of stories that were doing something similar. So that's how I think the book, found its place in the publishing world. And it was well reviewed, in the trades, and it made like best fantasy novels of the year lists and stuff like that. But it didn't sell particularly well. And there was a lot of conversation at the time about whether the cover was an issue, that people thought it looked too literary. I don't know if you can see this, but this is a sort of medieval picture of sort of jousting knights and such, with this more contemporary black and white freaked out person who is the Will character here. And so when the book went into paperback, they completely changed the look and tried to make it more conventional as a fantasy-looking novel. And there are elements of this that I like, but I always liked the original cover, but it didn't help the book sell. The paperback also didn't really help the book sell. So after a few years, it went out of print. When I got the rights back, I did a self-pub version of the book. There was also a second book called Willpower, which came out the year after the first one. And the book then was reissued with a new cover by Falstaff. That's the copy that is available at the moment now as a trade paperback. So it was an odd journey for this story, and it's one that I'm still really fond of. That it was. It's very character driven, which is quite unusual in fantasy, or at least was. And because it's a first person narrative, that means that everything that happens is mediated by the personality and voice of the main character, of Will. Nothing happens in the story that he doesn't experience directly. And that means that, for example, there are some large-scale battle scenes. And what you can't do within this kind of novel is do that very sort of Tolkien-esque grand scheme narrative where you're looking at a huge battle and he's able to sort of move around and show you different parts of the field and all these, various warriors doing noble and dramatic things. And since I was confined deliberately to Will's perspective, and Will is a guy who has no business being on a battlefield and is basically terrified all the time, barely knows how to use a sword, or in his case, mostly a crossbow. And so, it creates real narrative challenges because you get a lot of his panic and anxiety, but you also need to know what's going on in the battle. So that was part of the challenge. And like a lot of things in the story, it walks a sort of a tightrope, or at least a narrow path between balancing the sort of quirky and playful elements of the story, the fun parts, right? And it is supposed to be funny, and I think at least occasionally it is, but it's also still a serious adventure, um, in which there's all kinds of stuff happening and magical discoveries of magic and things along the way, and it becomes sort of a political. So like a lot of my books, it's a hybrid of a lot of different elements, and I think also maybe this is one of the reasons that it was a challenge to sell. But it's still a series that I really like. As I said, there's a second book called Willpower, and there is a little handful of 3 or 4 short stories that I wrote in the same series, and I often wonder about going back and doing a third or more. Though there has to be an audience to justify doing that, because I don't have time otherwise. What else? Uh, Part of the appeal of this story for me when I wrote it, and still, is that it does what fantasy often doesn't do, which is it puts the main character, the spotlight falls on the person who is in some ways least competent and least heroic. He's not an Aragorn. He's not even a Sam or a Frodo. He's somebody who doesn't want to be there, and will do whatever he can to get out of the situation with his own skin intact, even if that sometimes puts other people in jeopardy. Or at least that's where he starts. And so there's a real journey for him, a narrative journey, and an evolution as a character, which I find appealing because he's basically like us, like most regular people who are not heroic, and in difficult situations are most likely to want to get out of them rather than you know risk life and limb on for some abstract principle, which is sort of standard in high fantasy. So yeah, I was trying to sort of navigate this path between the sardonic and the epic. You know, whether that's successful or not, I guess, is up to you. But yeah, that's the story. So Act of Will. And I'll show you the thing one more time. And the second one is called Willpower. All right. Thank you. Talk to you soon.